All right, gentlemen, we are going to begin Chapter 8, and what we're going to do this week is look at Chapter 8 and Chapter 9. Chapter 8 really kind of finishes out our study of ecology. Chapter 4 and 5 and 8 come together and give us everything that we have in the ecology section. Chapter 8 is going to focus on populations and ecological populations, and then we're going to take that information and apply that to human population trends in Chapter 9. So you're going to want to keep track this week of the assignments and what's due when, especially with us not having class on Monday and the final exam being on Friday. I'm probably going to extend some stuff out through the last weekend of class. So here we have a list of stuff that's in this section. That list continues here. Again, the objectives. These you should take the time to look at and make sure through your studies that you are able to answer these questions, that you know the concepts well. We look at population in terms of ecology. First, we have to define what population is. Some of the stuff you've already seen in some of the labs that you have been doing. Okay, population is a group of organisms of the same species that live in a specific geographical area and interbreed. So we define population. It can be the number, but more specifically in terms of our studies in ecology, we're going to define population in terms of this group of organisms being separate out as a geographical separation, and because of that geographical separation, they breed within the group that they are a part of. And that is generally how we are looking at understanding and studying population in terms of ecology. We therefore understand it as a reproductive group. Ecologists define populations as a reproductive group. These are species that are reproducing. They're breeding with members of their own group or members of their own population. And so we can apply this word to the idea of the group of population in general, or to the size of the population, or to the number of individuals. There are lots of different aspects of any given population that ecologists are going to study as properties of that population to understand that population and further to make predictions about that population in the future. The first thing is density. And density, just like in math, it's a measurement of amount within a space. Okay, so with population, density is the number of individuals of the same species that live in a given unit of area. Okay, so the density of a population of field mice is not 32. It's 32 per square acre or per square meter, or so on and so forth. It's the number of that species within a unit of area. Okay. The other thing we talk about as ecologists is dispersion, and dispersion has to do with how the organisms within the population are distributed in the area of that population. So it has to do with pattern of distribution, and we can discuss dispersion in terms of it being even, or they are evenly dispersed, or clumped, or random, but it has to do with pattern of distribution of organisms. So we look at size in terms of population, we look at density in terms of population, we look at dispersion, and there are other properties that we're not going to go into, but ecologists look at all these and use these to actually describe a particular population. And when you are able to collect data over long periods of time, you can use these properties not only to describe that population, but to predict any changes that are taking place or that will take place within that population. So the most fundamental thing we look at with populations is how populations grow. What is happening in any given set of circumstances for that population to be able to grow. Okay, and the main thing that we're looking at here in terms of population growth is new offspring, births. Okay, compared to losses within that population, and that's being deaths. So we look at population growth by comparing birth to death and birth rate to death rate. And therefore, we can actually write, and ecologists use equations to actually study these population growth trends. The equation is any change in population size is equivalent to the number of births minus the number of deaths. It is always in that order. You always subtract deaths from births to calculate population change. Now we can take this further and we can talk about growth rate. And growth rate is a mathematical expression of the increase in the size of an organism or population over a given period of time. Rate is always defined. Anytime you see rate anywhere in science, anywhere in math, rate is always defined as something over a given period of time. Okay? And so growth rate is going to be the birth rate minus the death rate. Population growth is going to be the births minus the number of deaths, but growth rate is going to be the birth rate minus the death rate. And the growth rates of populations change. So it's not like when we are studying a population of animals in a particular area that rate is the same year after year. But the growth rate changes from one year to the next because populations change. Birth rates and death rates will increase or decrease from one year to the next. Everything is always in flux. And that allows us to at least conceptually understand that you can have positive growth rates, but you can also have negative growth rates, and you can have a growth rate that's zero, okay? No change over time. But for that growth rate to be zero, the average number of births needs to equal the average number of deaths. Okay, so what we have is birth rate and death rate, or births and deaths, end up being equal. And therefore, there is no positive growth, there is no negative or decline. It just stays zero. And in any given ecosystem, when we're looking at populations, the population would remain the same size if each pair of adults produced exactly 2 offspring and each of those offspring survived to reproduce. So now we have to look at this, and we have to understand that our study of populations within what we're talking about is a long-term study, because we have to look multi-generationally to be able to see this and to understand this. But if the adults in a population are not replaced by new births, the growth rate ends up being negative. And when you have negative growth rate year after year, you ultimately have what is witnessed as population shrinking or population decline. We can also, if we're talking about rates, we can also talk about how fast a population can grow. And we look at this in ecology with different populations. Generally speaking, with most organisms and most populations, what we tend to see is that populations are going to stay the same size from one year to the next. There are subtle changes, but generally speaking, populations stay the same size. We have lots of different things that kill many individuals before they can reproduce, and because you have lots of those things within an ecosystem that kill many individuals before they can reproduce, your number ends up and your rate ends up staying very close from one year to the next. And those things are going to exercise controls on the size of populations. And those things in longer term are going to have a impact on how the population evolves over time. And so one of the things we look at is called reproductive potential. A species' biotic potential is the fastest rate at which its populations can grow. And that rate, how the fastest that the population can grow, is limited by what we call the reproductive potential of any given species, and every species has a reproductive potential. It's basically the maximum number of offspring that a given organism can produce. Not the maximum number of offspring that the organism can produce in a year or in a reproductive cycle, but the maximum number of offspring that the organism can reproduce in its lifetime. That is what reproductive potential is. And then obviously we understand as we look at different species that some species are going to have really, really high reproductive potentials. They can produce a lot of organisms in their life. And some species are going to have really, really low reproductive potentials. Darwin calculated that it could take 750 years for a pair of elephants to produce 19 million descendants. Okay, while bacteria can produce that in a few days. Some bacteria may even be able to produce it in a few weeks. So obviously bacteria is going to have a higher reproductive potential than elephants. And this reproductive potential, as we continue to talk about that, that number increases as individuals produce more offspring at a time, or if they reproduce more often, or if they reproduce earlier in life. Any of those factors is going to have an increase effect on the reproductive potential of that particular species. But the one that has the greatest effect is reproducing earlier in life. So those organisms that become reproductively mature and are able to start reproducing earlier than other organisms are going to have the highest reproductive potential. Because reproducing earlier shortens the generation time, it shortens the average time it takes a member of the population to reach the age when it reproduces, and that compounds itself and just is going to lead to more reproduction in the lifetime of that individual. Generally, we see this in small organisms, bacteria and insects. Generally, bacteria and insects have shorter generation times. Very often they can reproduce when they're only a few hours or a few days old. Very often the life cycle of an insect after it comes out of its larval stage is in its fully mature stage, like a lot of flies, mayflies, and things like that, is hours or days that it lives at that point, and it's only reproducing. That's the only thing that happens in that last few hours or days of its life. But it certainly was a much quicker time lapse in order for it to reach that reproductive potential. And so what we see in insects and in bacteria is that their populations can grow very quickly. And it's not just the case. These are the easiest ones because it's so specific to see, but this is also the case with small mammals. Rabbits are known for having a high reproductive potential. They start pretty early in their life. They mature pretty early on, and then once they start able to reproduce, they actually can do it frequently and have multiple offspring many times throughout the course of a year. So bacteria and insects give us the most blatant, the most conspicuous example. The other end of the spectrum, of course, is large organisms, elephants, humans. It takes many years before these organisms can become sexually mature and are able to begin reproducing, and therefore their reproductive potential is much lower. Now, exponential growth. We talk about exponential growth almost in a theoretical sense when we talk about population growth. Exponential growth, it's a function of math. It's a log growth or a logarithmic curve, and it's a growth in which numbers increase by a certain factor in each successive time period. It's not something that really happens in nature. The conditions need to be just right for exponential growth to happen in nature. There's usually some type of population explosion where there's more than enough food, more than enough space, no competition, no predators. And those conditions, when they do occur and you see exponential growth, they only last for a short period of time anyway, because very soon there's not enough food and there's not enough space because this particular organism is reproducing so quickly. We see population explosions in terms of bacteria and in terms of mold growing on a new food source. And what we're going to see is that we can represent this as a curve. Large number of individuals is added to the population in each succeeding time period. It's actually added exponentially. So this curve here shows you that curve is an exponential curve. Okay, it's a mathematical function. Okay, we're talking about it in terms of growth. At 4 months, and at 8 months and at 12 months you see that the population increases exponentially. But even in terms of bacteria, this is not able to be maintained indefinitely. At some point, the bacteria have this population explosion, and you'll see this exponential curve, but eventually they're going to start running out of food, or they're going to start creating too many toxins that even affect them, and what we're going to see is that curve actually starts to level off or plateau. Now, what are the things that limit population growth? Because we don't see exponential growth in nature very often. There must be limits. There must be caps or governors, so to speak, that keep it at a certain level. Natural conditions are not ideal for constant population growing. Resources end up being used up. The environment changes. Death increase or births decrease. This can be, because food is not available, or space is not available, or predation increases. Competition increases because another species comes in. Natural selection plays out, therefore, in this scenario, and what ultimately happens is only certain members of any population survive and reproduce. And those become the properties that those who survive and reproduce become the distinguishing properties of that particular group or that particular population in that space, in that time. The next thing we talk about is carrying capacity, and by definition, it is the largest population that an environment can support at any given time. Okay, and there's reasons why. It's always going to get to that level and never really be much above that level. In terms of populations and ecology, we can see a population increase beyond that number, but it never stays beyond that number. It may jump above that number, but then it's going to drop down below that number. So the point is, you end up deciphering that is the number that it's always going to be around. Ecosystems change. Carrying capacity is difficult to predict or calculate. So really what carrying capacity ends up being is more of an estimate. We look at average population sizes over time. We look at population crashes. We look at average population growth. And we're able to come up with a range or a number where that population is always going to be around. This diagram shows this. You see an initial stage of exponential growth. The dotted yellow line represents the carrying capacity, and that initial stage of exponential growth quickly overshoots that carrying capacity, but then very quickly you see a correction, and it actually corrects below the carrying capacity. The dotted blue line shows if that correction goes out of control and a population crashes. Then you see it's going to correct back up and then correct back down, and what you see is it's always a little bit north or a little bit south of what that number is for carrying capacity. You're able to decipher and estimate generally it's that general area that population is going to be in. Limitations of resources are really important to our understanding of population. Species reach their carrying capacity when it consumes a particular natural resource at the same rate at which the ecosystem reproduces or produces that resource. So you've got this food that this particular species eats, and that food is being eaten up at the same rate that it's being produced within that particular area. You're not going to be able to see that population grow any higher than that. Okay. When that happens, we call that resource the limiting resource. Of all the things that could limit the population growth of that particular species, that is the thing. Okay? Could be space, could be food, could be water, could be, reproductive or breeding opportunities, whatever it is. That ends up being the thing that limits that population, so that population does not go much above where it's at. We call it the limiting resource. And the supply of the most severely limited resources determines the carrying capacity of an environment for a particular species. So that is what drives the carrying capacity, which is ultimately then, guys, going to be driving what the population is of that species in that place at any given time. There's also obviously competition within a population. Okay, members of the population are going to use the same resources in the same ways, so they have to compete. Okay, and this is going to cause any given population of any given species to near or be at its carrying capacity. And sometimes what we see in an ecosystem, instead of competing for a limiting resource, members compete indirectly for social dominance or for territory. When you have mating season, when you have white-tailed deer and bucks are in rut, the bucks are literally competing for mating rights. We saw this in some of the Planet Earth videos we watched. So competition can be for lots more things than just food, but all competition is going to have an impact on the size of that population of that species in that area. And it's part of the process of natural selection as well. So you have competition for territory, which is an area defended by one or more individuals against other individuals. Territory is valuable because it gives space, it gives shelter, it gives food, it gives breeding opportunities and breeding sites. So territory is very, very important in terms of understanding species and their interactions within an ecological study. And we actually find organisms expending large amounts of energy and large amounts of time competing. What happens right prior to the rut with white-tailed deer from the end of August through September and October, they eat, building up all their fat stores so that they have the energy to spend 2 to 4 weeks competing during the rut for breeding opportunities. They don't do a lot of eating during that time. So we see how all of this interplays to create the competition that has an impact on a given population. And there can be what we call population regulation. Population size can be limited that can actually have some connection to the density of the population, or maybe don't have a connection to the density of the population. And remember, we're limiting population. The most important limit is causes of death, death in particular, and the causes of death could be density dependent or density independent. When the cause of death in a population is density dependent, deaths occur more quickly in a crowded population than in a sparse population. So, the cause of death is connected to the number of organisms in a given area. The more organisms in that area, the more die. We would call that density dependent. When the individuals are densely packed together, more of them die. That's density dependent. Things like not enough resources or predation or disease result in higher rates of death. The disease one, think about what happens here at FUMA. Right? Disease is always density dependent. You've got 400 guys all living in the barracks. If somebody gets the flu, everybody gets the flu. Okay? That's kind of what we're talking about here. Density independent, a certain proportion of population is going to die regardless of how many organisms are in that particular area. It's going to be the same thing. It affects all populations in a uniform way. A severe weather or a natural disaster, right? A blizzard or hurricane natural disaster, really going to be viewed as density independent because it's going to cause the same number of deaths no matter how many are there or how many are packed in to a given area.